Welcome back to another episode of the On Coaching Podcast with Magness and Marcus. I am Steve Magness, the Deputy Director of High Performance West, joined by my good friend and colleague, John Marcus, the Director of High Performance West. John, another glorious day. How are you doing?
Oh, we in the building. Back to give the people what they want. I'm excited for this one. This is going to be a fun podcast.
It is, because we get to tackle the topic of threshold training.
Oh my goodness. That's the most opaque ocean of definition ever. What does it mean? Does it mean marathon pace? Does it mean 10K pace? I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I know what it means for me. And Steve knows what it means for him, and that's what we're going to unpack.
And I think that's the key there, is what it means to you or me, right? So jumping into the definition a little bit, one of the things when I first started my science education is I was like, we're going to define this, right? And then you read the research and you read the books and and they're all based on lactate or VO2 or whatever. And all of a sudden you have literally probably 6, 7, 8, 9 different names and definitions for very similar things, right? So you can say, hey, the lactate threshold, the anaerobic threshold, the aerobic threshold, the 4 millimole threshold, the maximum lactate steady state, all of these things, which nebulously means something in this same kind of parameter and zone. So it's not just coaches that are confused. It's not just, scientists that are confused. We've done a really, really poor job of figuring out and defining what this quote unquote lactate threshold or threshold actually means. And when we can't define what it means, we can't actually apply it very well to our training.
Exactly. Precision matters. And I think whenever you create a schedule, whenever you're designing training, there is a relevant outcome that one is pursuing for the athlete to be able to, express in the competitive arena on a certain day or in a certain time period, right? And so we just say, we call this thing steady state. We call it tempo. We call it threshold, aerobic threshold, lactate threshold, anaerobic threshold. There's a lot of different thresholds out there. And I think, we need to very clearly define which threshold is the most potent for different event groups. Also, which thresholds are complementary to each other. And then which ones are just, in my opinion, or maybe in Steve's opinion, junk, because there are some junk ones as well. And I think that is where we get a lot of disagreement, is just in the semantics and definitions or lack thereof of these different quote unquote zones. And again, you can define it however you want. I mean, there's a lot of different ways, right? Depending on your blood lactate levels, right? Or heart rate or pace. Those tend to be typically the most used ways to define that quote unquote zone for that type of threshold training. But then too, you have to ask yourself, I ask myself all the time, why? Why are we doing it? What is the impact that we want to have? How is this going to help the athlete get better? And I think over and over and over again, that why must be top of mind, because, sometimes we default to thinking we're right, but we need to stop and ask, why do we think, or why do I think I'm right? And if you ask why you think you're right, it forces you to reflect a little bit and really critically do a deep dive and try to figure out, is this the best course or not?
So I think that why portion brings us to a good question, and one that I've thought about really a lot frequently. In fact, had a good conversation with our good friend Vern Gambetta yesterday on the same subject. And that is, I think there needs to be a clear distinction between threshold in terms of a zone of training and threshold in terms of the quality we're changing, right? And I think sometimes we intertwine those and get it in our mind that, in order to improve this scientific thought of improving my lactate threshold, what does that mean? I do lots of threshold training. I do lots of work at this threshold, which we're going to define. And the reality is, like, you can improve the quality of the threshold by doing a variety of work, right?
Right.
I can, if I was a Igloy disciple, I would do it through, 400-meter repeats manipulated in the correct way. Or if I'm a swim coach, right, I use a lot of broken up sets and reps instead of going out for the traditional 20-minute threshold run or the, longer 60-minute at marathon pace or whatever it is. So I think even before getting into the definitions, I think it's important to understand the difference and dichotomy between the quality that you're trying to develop and the intensity zone, which we've kind of just assigned. Right.
Right. And you're right. The definition matters and the why matters a lot. And so I think it's on us as coaches to stop being so sloppy in throwing around this term called threshold, because there's a lot of weighted assumption for different coaches who emphasize a different type of quality enhancement in their program about what threshold is. So there's 3 thresholds in my schema when I'm writing training. You have aerobic threshold, you have lactate threshold, and then you have anaerobic threshold. Those are the 3 thresholds that I really put into different buckets that have a different quality of enhancement, that have a different methodology and different modalities to subject the athlete to through various duration of types of work and intensity of type of work. Steve, how does that fit with your view or spectrum of this thing called threshold training?
Yeah, so to me, it's this ambiguous, continuous.
Ambiguous, continuous, all of it.
Ambiguous. It is. It's this spectrum, right? It's this intensity versus how much volume we can sustain at. And what I tend to do is get away from the threshold tempo like names. Instead, I tend to look at it and look at around marathon pace or around pretty steady, right? I look at it as around half marathon pace, right? Or around about what you could run for an hour, 15K to half marathon pace, which is differs. That would be coincide with your kind of traditional lactate threshold if we use scientific terms. And then I use what I call like a pressing tempo or like a pressing threshold work, where we're just pressing things down, where it's in between that 10K and half marathon pace, where it's like you're pushing the edge. Okay. The other way I like to describe these to my kids is the marathon pace steady is just that. It's steady. You're under control. The kind of half marathon pace effort tempo that we use, that is where you're just above that line where you're riding it, right? Where you can say a short sentence or two, where you can say, when I was training, we used to say like, I feel good, I feel great, I want to communicate. And you just like, you could get that phrase out and that's about it, right? So you're just riding that line. And then the last form that I use is that pressing part where we're pushing right over that line, right? Where we're no longer just on that edge of in control, but we're like teetering on that. Well, this is about as much as I can sustain for a prolonged time. So that's kind of how I see it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you have to relate it back to racing efforts, because we do have uniform distances that we compete over. And so why would we engage in some scientific terminology that has no correlation for the athlete at hand if we can't relate it back to a racing effort or a racing intensity that they're going to face? And so I think we're simpatico there, because I call the aerobic threshold marathon pace. I call it that steady or tempo. That's what in my taxonomy of terms, steady or tempo basically means the clip that you run for anywhere between 90 minutes to 2.5 hours of racing, which falls into about half marathon pace. I call threshold sloppily the 15K intensity effort, your lactate threshold. That's what I default when I say threshold. I use that because, again, when you start to say, you list the spectrum of thresholds, it starts to get confusing for the athlete. So I've just picked it arbitrarily. That's me. That's how I do it. That's how I communicate with the athletes. So I know when it's threshold, it's going to be at about 15K race pace. And then the anaerobic threshold, or what you're calling pressing, I typically just call it 8K race pace and faster. Like, it's like this kind of 8K, it can be 10K, it can be to 6K. For me, in my world, 5K and faster work is much different and has a much different intensity and specificity to it. But anything that's kind of in that range, depending on the individual that I'm working with, that makes sense for that type of rhythm where we view it as our anaerobic threshold, that's really how I define it.
Right.
So again, I think everyone coach has to know and create their own terminology, but be very specific with their athletes so the athlete knows where they are or what is expected of them or what is assigned of them that day in training, so they can run at the appropriate intensity to get the response and the adaptation and from the stimulus that is asked of them.
And I think that's the key right there, is that as coaches, we need to be able to communicate the intensity and the effort level that we're looking for, right? The scientific definition does not matter to a large degree if we can't communicate like the intensity and effort level that we're looking at. For example, like when I was a younger athlete, I used to have a device that would measure lactate levels, and I'd just like mess around with that all the time on some of my threshold type runs, right? Your 4 miles at low 5-minute pace, for example. And depending on the day and the shape, like I could either nail it where I'd be pretty steady and lactate levels wouldn't rise, but sometimes like they just keep rising, and I was at around the same pace, but the effort level was increased. And like when I saw that, that's where I said, hey, wait a minute, like, okay, even from a scientific standpoint, like I'm not going to be good enough to like nail this like term all the time, and maybe that I don't need to, but like I need to teach what the effort is that I'm looking for, because that's going to dictate things to a larger degree than anything else. So I think that gets us to the point where the vocabulary matters, and how you communicate what your expectations are for that intensity matters a lot.
Yeah. And I think, too, you have to decide for yourself and the type of athletes you're working with, which you need to create a hierarchy. You need to create, in my opinion, a rank order about which ones are most important in your catalog of training and which ones are least important. Since I work with mostly milers to 10K athletes, mostly track and field type athletes, without a doubt, number one is always going to be lactate threshold, or at 15K race pace. And then number two is going to be that anaerobic threshold, or 8K type race case. Long ago, I came across the work of Steven Seller, the American-born sports scientist who is now in Norway, that discussed polarized training methodology, which to me is the most cutting edge, most useful research that is out there right now, because what he does is he looks at what elite athletes are actually doing and what responses they're getting, whether it's cross country, skiing, or cycling, or distance running. It's not some, pontification or hypothesis, and then we're going to take this biopsy or take these readings of untrained college males or females and this and that. He's actually looking at what the best in the world are doing to train and get better. And I think we have to stop and look at that and understand that you need to check your references. Even though the scientific method gives us a degree of certainty, what is the resource? Where is it coming from? If you're training to do an uncommon thing, look to what uncommon people are doing. Don't look to what the common folk are doing. And it's not a put down of anybody. It's just these are people whose livelihoods are, on the line and that matter, doing at the highest level. And yet we want to sit here and argue about the validity of research on college students who are untrained and partying 2-3 nights, a week. So, that's my little soapbox rant real quick. But anyways, his research has been really cutting edge and has shown there is a gray zone, which is about marathon type pace, where you're working hard, but not hard enough to get a quality response. But then also, too, you're working a little too hard to get a recovery response. So it's this gray area which his research has suggested is worth your time and effort, energy to shy away from, because it's a minimal response area and zone. Now, I've interpreted that, and I have said, great, won't touch it. Even for people I'm training to run the marathon, won't touch it. And people are like, well, why don't you run marathon pace for the marathon? Well, that's a big can of worms, because it seems logically very straightforward, because every other event that we train for, we run event-specific paces. But if you're telling me that running marathon pace is a gray zone in an area where I do not get a whole lot of return on my investment of time and energy, I'm going to stay away from that. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invest in faster running. So what I call, threshold or lactate threshold, 15K race pace running, and faster. And I'm going to chop it up into manageable chunks. So instead of going for an hour at that, it might be an hour's worth of work, or maybe even 75 minutes worth of work, but in the most potent dosage. And what his research has shown, and what has suggested, is there is a higher potency for work around 8 minutes in duration with mini breaks, because the body at a cellular level does not know the difference between running 3 times 8 minutes at this 15K race pace intensity with 60 seconds rest versus just running 24 minutes straight. You'll probably actually be able to run faster for the 8-minute rep, thus getting a higher response, because cognitively, on a psychological level, you'll be looking forward to that 1-minute quote unquote break, even though metabolically, physiologically, it's not really a break. But since you're going to perceive it to be one, you're like, oh, okay, I can go again. So I have gone far, far away since I've experimented, had experience with, had feedback from athletes based off this idea from this research, from the long, steady tempo run. I don't think I've really prescribed anything over 20 minutes steady to any athlete I've worked with, including Tara Welling, for years here, because it just, to me, didn't seem like the highest return on investment. Now, does that mean that people aren't doing 60 to 80 minutes worth of 15K race pace or threshold? No, not at all. We're just doing it in chunks. We're doing it in like 5 times 8 minutes with 60 seconds rest, something of that nature. And my experience and evidence from the people that I work with is they've gone a lot better in that area, and their stamina has increased significantly compared to other times when they employed more traditional tempo running of 5-mile tempo, 6-mile tempo straight. Now, there is a time and place for that. I'm not discrediting it by any means, because it also can build grit, it can build a certain degree of tenacity, etc. There's some value there, but just I've made that call for my own practice for the type of athlete I work with right here, right now, and it has worked really well based off the feedback and the evidence of the results that we've gotten. Steve, what about you?
Oh man, there's a lot to unpack there. Woo. All right, where to begin? I think the first thing that needs to be addressed is, what are you training for? Right? Mm-hmm. Are you training for a 10K, 5K, or half marathon, or are you training for a marathon? Like, what's the event demands, right? And then what do you bring to the table from a physiological standpoint, from a cognitive standpoint? Because all these, and I love Seiler's work, but one of the things I always have problems with on all these things is that it breaks it down to this might not be best from one parameter, right? From a physiological standpoint, let's say, like, this stimulus might not make as much sense as we think it should, right? But then performance training is multifactorial, right? So if I have an athlete who maybe from a stamina standpoint doesn't need a lot of marathon pace stuff, right? Doesn't need it, doesn't benefit from it. But from a cognitively demanding focus standpoint, needs to be stuck doing the same thing, running the same pace for, 80 minutes because that is their weak point, then I have to consider, right? Or if I have someone who, from a fueling standpoint, their body, for whatever reason, is burning carbs through the roof, and is going to run out of fuel, then I have to take him to that place and let his body fail, maybe with a really prolonged thing. So I think when you look at these things, we have to understand that there's incredible complexity behind it. So what I tend to do, and this differs a little from you, I think, is that let's start with our standard 5-6 miles worth of tempo work. Okay, what I tend to do, and I started this back when I was a high school kid or coach, is I like to assign a total amount that I want to get in, and then I let it up to the athletes to figure out how they get there sometimes. So I might say, hey, I want 30 minutes of this effort level, right? But if you get to 5 minutes and you're feeling oh, I'm a little over the edge, I need to back it off, then go 5 minutes, take a minute break, and then go again. And that's kind of how it is. It's okay, sometimes you're going to go 20 minutes and then take a break and then do, 3 by 3 minutes and then a minute at the end, right? As long as you're at this effort that I'm trying to get you at, then split it up as you can. And I think that gives some autonomy to the athletes when you do that. But it also allows you to split these things up. From a longer standpoint, when I'm working with 10K, half marathon, etc., I still like that longer stimulus, but what I've shifted to more recently is doing it in progression style, right? So instead of your big 10-mile run or 8 to 10 mile tempo run at, around marathon pace, what I tend to do is I might give a 7 to 8 mile progression, right? So for someone let's take Brian Barraza when he was training for cross country, that might start as slow as 5:40 pace, but it might end at 4:45 pace for the last mile, right? So we're working our way through these blends of tempos, thresholds, etc., and getting this long sustained aerobic effort, but coming through. So that's how I've shifted to handle some of those longer sustained aerobic works, is turning them into progressions. And even in terms of splitting it up, right? So one of my favorite things to do is 3 by 3 mile with 800 meters easy in between, where we're progressing each 3 miles throughout. So we're kind of blending through that continuum of high-end aerobic efforts. Now, where things get really interesting is the marathon, because again, I think there's something to be said for the fueling and the cognitive demanding approach and what they need to give them the mental fortitude and grit and confidence to get through the marathon race. So what I try to do is include enough marathon pace work, or enough big marathon pace work if this athlete needs it, where it gives them that physiological reaction, that biomechanics of running 13, 14 miles at that effort, right? And that fueling, cognitive demanding of spending that much time on your feet. So I don't do it as much as I used to, but we'll do several big, maybe 2 or 3 big marathon paced efforts throughout a 16-week marathon build, for example. What I like to do instead is to simulate that a little bit with either progression within a long run, right? So maybe 10 miles easy, and then 8 miles progression, right? So you use the first 10 miles to get your legs a little tired, and then you only have to do a shorter segment of 8 miles to kind of press that zone, or just like a longer steady thing. So instead of, for instance, Zach Hine, who marathon pace is what, like 5:15, 5:10, like he had a lot of success when we instituted, hey, you're just going to go 20 miles. And I want this almost like Lydiard used to do it, like 20 miles at 6 minutes to 5:45 pace, right? Where we're not pressing down into that marathon pace, but it's fast enough where it's aerobically demanding and cognitively demanding, and it's going to make you feel kind of tired at the end. But we're not really on that aerobic threshold or that aerobic tempo marathon pace that we use, but we can kind of sustain it for a longer time. So that's hopefully a quick unpack of how I use all these things.
Yeah, I mean, my mind's open. I don't know. I'm a little skeptical though about marathon pace in general. I look at so many athletes and well-intended athletes and coaches who employ marathon pace work. How many times have you heard about, I did 18 miles at my marathon pace. I did 20 miles at my marathon pace. I did 2 or 3 of those workouts. It went great. And then come race day, boom, blows up. It's too consistent of a narrative. And I've seen it too often where it's this almost false positive.
My counter to that is this: is if you look at what most of those programs do, you have to look at how often they do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
How often are they trying to do that big tempo, right? Or that big marathon pace effort? A. B, are they using that as a test session, a proving session?
Right.
Right? Which is the temptation to do it, because you sit there and you say, oh, if I can run 18 miles at marathon pace, I'm going to be good. So I'm proving myself in this, right? But I think if you manipulate training and, again, have small spices of it, Neely Spence is an athlete who is really great at doing this. It's her longest, I forget what build it was. It could have been Boston, but her longest like marathon pace effort was kind of like 10 miles, right? And it was just within a run, a long run. And it wasn't to prove herself to get that she could run that pace. It was like, okay, like I need this mechanical, I need this cognitive, I need this fueling side, this physiological of like, creating efficiency at this rhythm. So I'm going to just run this rhythm long enough to feel it. Right? And I think there's, especially for marathoners, there's something to that. I think where we go wrong is it's almost like the recreational, like the weekend warrior. What do they do when they train for the marathon? They put all their emphasis on the long run. Like nothing else matters, right? You could run 2 days a week of, 3 miles, but then on that Sunday, you're doing 20 miles and it makes zero sense, right?
Right.
But they've been told like, oh, in order to run the marathon, I need to do the long run. Well, I think at the elite level, we do the same thing, only it's in order to run the marathon, like we have to nail 18 miles at this marathon pace, and I've been there too. Like I remember, I remember pacing people when I was with thou who shall not be named, but like it was a couple weeks before the marathon. It's like, oh my God, these people are going to run so great. They're going to kill it. They're going to win, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because they nailed, the 17 miles or whatever it was at some quick pace, where the single goal was to run this 17 miles as fast as we can possibly average, right? When you set yourself in that situation, I think you're setting yourself up to fail, because you're changing the emphasis from practice of accomplishing like some sort of gain that makes us grow to proving ourselves in order to get it done.
Yeah. I mean, it again, evidence is the most difficult thing to ascertain, because again, we're looking at outliers, we're looking at people who are doing it at a high level. And then you have, stories or, different, perspectives of people who are kind of at the sub-elite level and then also recreational level, which are all valid. Don't get me wrong, but I'm always curious about, we're looking for best practices, right? Best methods. And I've seen at least a shift in my own thought and thinking from, this is devolving to kind of a marathon training discussion, but to employ the same logic and mindset that we use in track training, which is 2 hard workouts or maybe 3 hard workouts or semi-hard workouts a week and then a long run on the weekend. And we just translate that right into the marathon type work, 2 difficult, speedier workouts and a longer run, which can also be a workout itself. And I've just noticed recently coaches at the highest level who are in their athletes are having competitive marathons and being able to compete in the latter stages, which is what counts, are employing longer long runs, right? Like 3-hour long runs if they're aiming to run 2 hours or 2.5 hours for the event. And I wonder too if there's an unexplored threshold there. And we're talking right now in terms of metabolic threshold, but again, what about the psychological threshold, right? And I think the cognitive threshold is something that is yet to be explored or put a lot of emphasis and energy on, which is if you're training for a marathon and you're doing a 3.5-hour long run, which is 90 minutes, 30 to 60 minutes longer than you'll have the time spent on the feet. If you can create a cognitive threshold to be able to cope with running for however long at just a normal, relaxed, not difficult rhythm, does that have a translation to your physiological threshold as well, right? And so I think we spend so much time in this metabolic physiological world that we forget the psychological lens and how important that is as well. And so when you're doing this threshold work, whatever it may be, that's important why in question to ask as well. What is the psychological threshold for this athlete? Because let's go to the opposite end of the spectrum. Let's say Michaela Fricker, who's a 2 flat 800 meter competitor I work with, getting her to do a mile at 6-minute pace, dear goodness, like that is the most difficult thing that she could ever do. And it's all in her head, because she can do it, but that is her threshold work. We will do like 2 by a mile at 6-minute pace. And man, it just takes all the focus in the world. She's just like, okay, I'm going to get this. And it's like, you run half mile at 2 flat. How is this? But, people look at that from a physiological lens. Like, oh, there's no way she can run that fast. She doesn't have the stamina or, the requisite, anaerobic threshold to do it. If she can't run 2 by a mile at 6 flat, well, it's about the athlete in front of you, right? Because psychologically, it's a big barrier for her. So that's another important threshold I think we need to respect when discussing these different training thresholds.
100%. Because Mark English is the same way. It's funny. Like I consider his aerobic training sometimes is like 1 mile 5:30 pace. And you write that down and you're just like, okay. But like that's or like using shorter Fartlek to get the same thing, right? Where it's like, minute on, minute off. Like this is kind of aerobic for you. And I think that's where it's important to again look at the athlete in front of you and understand like what are the demands, because like in any traditional scientific view of things, like 1 or 2 miles at this quote unquote slower effort that shouldn't do much, but it does, right? And it's what's needed for them in front of you. And I think that's where sometimes it gets back to what I talked about in the beginning is, are we worried about the zone or the quality we're developing? Because if we're worried about the quality we're developing, then that 2 by 1 mile at 6-minute pace for Michaela, or that 1 mile at 5:20, 5:30 pace, whatever it is for Mark, is developing that aerobic quality that we're seeking. But if we're talking about running in the zone, whatever zone we've defined, then it's not, again, that a discussion I had with Vern Gambetta, who was working with the really strong miler 1500 runner Peter Callahan, and he was telling me how he's eliminated all of his threshold work and in place of it put fartleks, right?
Yeah.
Because he's like, oh, this kid's a miler who has a certain attitude about him, and I'm going to develop that quality but I'm going to do it in a different way than like the traditional, oh, I have to run at this zone. I'm going to do it Fartlek style.
But wait, time out. Fartlek is traditional. Let's just
it is, right?
I mean, it's going way back to Pavo, right? I mean, that's like one of the OG training messages, Fartlek.
Right. And but I think that's a good point. And I think what's happened is like if you trace the history of it, which we will, by the way, in our HPW Scholar Seminar. So if you haven't, check that out.
Supreme.
Supreme
yes. Scholar Supreme Seminar.
50 days of John and I just hammering this stuff down. But wait, yes, I'm very excited. So this is a plug. Check that out on HPW because like we're tracing the history of training so that you guys understand this and we understand it. But that's a good point. But it Fartlek has taken on this untraditional, definition because it's not structured or not highly
there's freedom. There's freedom to it. That was the point of Fartlek was speed play, right? Yeah. And you could manipulate it based on how fast you ran the actual on portion and how long, and then too manipulate it based on how fast or slow and how long or short was the off section. And so my argument is exactly this. We sit here in the modern era talking about these thresholds and, talking about millimoles and, different aerobic, anaerobic, and lactate. But two, how much of that was explored and maximized with just something as simple as Fartlek? And I think, when you tell someone, because I think we had this discussion with Vern, or maybe I had this discussion with Vern about a year ago, was like, yeah, I just don't think all this structured threshold training is as effective as just Fartlek. And so the last year with a lot of HPW elites that I'm working with, I've assigned and given them more Fartlek, even like in the fall, right? Like I had like Michaela and Eleanor Fulton doing on-track Fartlek where we would just start in lane 3 in the middle of the track. So yeah, they're on the track, and so I can watch them because they like running their stuff on the track, but they don't know where they are, so they can't really get a split. And it's just like blow a whistle, go for 3 minutes. Blow a whistle, go easy for a minute. Blow a whistle, So you don't even need the watch. You're just running completely free of even that burden of seeing how much more longer you have, right? So it was a, opportunity for me to kind of experiment and explore. And that's really, we got to remember, that's what training is about. There's no right or wrong. There's experiment, there's explore. The only judges are the result, right? The outcome you have to own. The outcome is what it is. And that is the only thing that can judge. And then from that, you get this evidence and you get this feedback about if what you explored and experimented with was of usefulness or not, because the athlete was either able to compete at the level they want to on the relevant day or not. So, I think that's important for us to air that bias that we have right now, because, we have this great work from Daniels and we have Vigil and we have all these amazing physiologists who have made it a little bit more exact and precise so we can have more confidence and reassurance about if we do this type of training, we'll get this type of response, systematically in this much time, generally speaking, which is important to understand, but then too, sometimes also really important just to throw out the window and go have fun.
Yeah, no, I think, and that's why, like I mentioned, the way that I like to do thresholds a lot is giving that power back to the person. Because I've thinking as coaches, like we've fallen into, again, using the histories, like the Gershler-Stampfel model of intervals where it's all controlled, right? Mm-hmm. And that's won out over the unstructured approach. And I think if you come back down to training, and we'll go on all sorts of tangents here, but it's a decision-making process. And if we can empower our athletes to take control over that decision, then like we're preparing them better for the act and skill of racing. So the Canadian researcher and athletics aficionado who wrote the book on Geber Selassie, the greatest, I think it was, Jem Dennison, has put together some great pieces on how the training environment, on how we are constraining athletes by creating environments like on the track where everything is structured, measured, expected of like where we start, where we finish, what the reps look like, etc. We've just ingrained it. And by doing that, we've lost some skill, and we've lost the ability to explore both from a training standpoint, but also from a person standpoint of seeing what actually works, what it feels like to work through our gears, understand different efforts, not just run around in circles and know where the start and finish line is. And by introducing some of this unstructured play into it can do great things. And as you mentioned, like it can be as simple as shifting a lane and a starting point on the track. Or, my high school coach used to have us, we had this 1 mile loop with a lot of offshoots, and he used to just stand there and be like, okay, we're going to do 5 of these. Like, I don't care what loop you take. I don't care where you go. You're in this group of 5 athletes who are all pretty similar. And I'm just going to tell you, like, hey, at the beginning of this loop, like, Steve's in charge of this loop. And what that meant was, like, I would decide when to surge, when to slow down, like, how hard we should going, when to push. And then the next loop would come, and it would be, my friend Paulo would be in charge. And, like, we just switched that off where we were getting, some autonomy and deciding, like, how hard to push and when not to push, but also having to respond to this others in this situation as we would in a race versus all just being in a line and like knowing what we were doing in practice.
It's I think coaching nature to be overly prescriptive with everything, that's overcoaching to some degree, right? It's just prescription on prescription. And then you have to ask yourself, what's the point of the workout? Is the point of the workout to grade the workout is the athlete trying to, do the workout as you prescribed and expected so they can get an A in the workout? Or are you, instead of grading the athlete's paper, helping them to get the A? And where we get the A is on race day, right? And I think you hit it spot on, Steve. Having this overly prescriptive construct of workouts where it's a pace, a number of sets, number, of reps within a set and certain paces that must be, ran, it limits the skill acquisition or skill refinement of instinct, because instinct is what champions have more than non-champions. Instinct is what, creates the most amazing type of races. Instinct is really, to me, the skill or the talent that most people don't put a lot of stock in, because that instinct happens in a heartbeat. It's a quick decision. It's a fast decision. When we talk about decision making, that's really what we're talking about. Quick and fast decisions, such as in, I forget the Daniel's last name, but in Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, their whole body of Kahneman. Yes, in Kahneman's whole body of research for 50 years, it's not about the right decision. It's about the quick decision that you go with. Because if you sit here and contemplate the right decision, well, should I go at 200 meters or should I go at 300 meters? Let me think. The moment's been lost, right? And so instinct, we've habituated instinct almost out of the athlete's cognitive process in a highly structured workout environment versus encouraged it. Because on race day, you have to be able to compete, instinctually, because what is a race? It's a total improv affair. Like, it's an improv environment. So we're going from a highly controlled and structured environment to an improv environment. And that's where I think Fartlek nails it, because it does, stimulate and achieve this, threshold component wherever it sits on the threshold spectrum. But also, too, it allows that athlete the ability to practice and hone their instinct a little bit. And that's what we have to remember, right? Practice is the environment and the conditions that you're setting yourself up for race day, right? I always remind my athletes, race day should be normal. Practice is habituating a response to certain speeds, certain demands, certain asks, certain, ability to do this sport called running. And race day should be no different. It's a normal thing. It's just, instead of practice now, we have a race where the defined controllable and defined element is how far we are going and what time the race starts. And everything else I get to create. And so rather than being a victim on race day, you should be a creator on race day. Don't be a victim of, oh, it's too fast for me. Oh, it's this. Be a creator. I made it so. I made the race happen like this. And that, to me, again, as we've gone on this tangent, is where the cognitive threshold is just as important as the metabolic threshold. Because if you've built that metabolic threshold up to the height of that organism, where the organs and the physiological systems are all clicking on cylinders, but that psychological threshold is bankrupt, so what? So what?
I think those are some great points. And like, to sum up this tangent, I'm reading a book called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle, and I'm going to quote a section of it because I think it's very pertinent to this overcoaching idea. And in it, he's talking about Navy SEALs and a Team 6 commander, Navy SEAL Team 6 commander. And the commander was relaying the story of how he once was on a mission or watching a mission with some Army Rangers. And here you go. The Rangers commander and I were together at a nearby base observing the drone video feed of the mission. The entire time the Ranger commander was on the radio with his guys. He was talking, giving orders, do this, look out for that. He was acting like a coach on the sideline yelling plays. At some point, this commander notices I'm not saying a word, and he gives me this look, almost in disbelief, like, why aren't you telling your guys what to do? It was pretty striking. Our guys and their guys doing the same mission. He's talking the whole time, and we aren't saying a thing. And the answer is this: because we don't need to. I know my guys are going to solve the problems themselves. And I think that right there is the same thing that we're looking at from a coaching standpoint, right? When we overcoach it, right? Overstructure it, we're solving the problem for the athlete in practice. But if we structure practice sometimes in the way that allows them to have, take charge, figure out the decisions for themselves, solve the problems, then when it comes to race day, they're going to be in a position to instinctually react and instinctually solve the different problems thrown at them. Whereas if they're not, if we overcoach them, then come race day, what happens is if a problem arises that isn't one that we've coached them on, or one where we're not sitting there yelling at them, then they're going to freak out, then they're going to miss the jump, then they're going to miss the break, and they're not going to know what to do.
And, what's the cost of this? Well, some might say it's failure, because if you're giving someone an opportunity to explore and create, it's not always going to be successful. But how many times did a parent overcoach a kid how to walk? The kid learned mostly on its own by looking around and saying, yeah, all these human beings can do it, so can I. And it was a lot of getting up, falling down, a lot of false starts, right? And I think we have to remember failure isn't a myth, it's a total myth. All there is learning experience. And all there is refinement of your process, refinement of how you're going about it from the learning experience that is the outcome or result of that day's effort, whether that's in practice or whether it's in a race. This whole culture of failure and like, oh my God, success and fail. No, it's a myth. It's a total myth. If you look at it through the lens of just all I have is to learn, this worked, this didn't work. I did this and I got this result. I didn't do this and I got this result. That's how we get better, right? And two, it's the same thing about, bickering over semantics of threshold. I mean, Steve has his methodology that works through his experience and evidence and considerations of scientific data and research, and so do I. And who's to say whose athletes are not as successful or least successful? I mean, you look at Tara Welling, who won the half marathon championships in 2016, trained completely different in a completely different manner than Natasha Rogers, who won it the next year. And So to say like now Steve's method is better than my method, or my method is better than his, or this person's method is better than someone else. No. Like there's just learning. We're always learning. Like I learned a lot today listening to Steve. I go, those are things I would never have considered, or things that I didn't think of that would have an impact. And, my mind has always changed. Every podcast I do here, and every time I go to a coaching conference or a track meet and talk to other coaches. And I think when we get caught up in that myopic, stubborn mindset that we have to do it like this because we've all lost, and, coach and athlete included.
And I think it comes down to like no one has answers, right? No one has the magic answer, right? We're all exploring, and the minute you stop exploring is the time that it's death, right? You stop learning, you stop growing, you stop thinking. And I think out of anything, what I've gone out of this is that you need to think and have a reasoning behind what you're doing, right? You need to understand that like my definitions will differ from John's definitions, right? But that's okay as long as I define them in a way that makes sense and that is communicated effectively to the athletes I'm working with, right? It's not about having like the one clear, true definition of threshold, and if it isn't this, then we're all wrong. No, that's not what it's about. It's about figuring out what the definition is that makes sense in your model of training, right? And is communicated to your athletes. And, think about those things and think about why you're doing things, right? I'm going to go back and look and see, hey, do I really need these marathon pace long workouts, or am I holding on to them as a security blanket because I've done them for so long? Or, maybe I do, maybe I don't. But in that exploration is where I'm going to grow as a coach. So challenge yourself to explore, no different than John and I are doing, no different than Vern Gambetta is doing, and saying like, hey, I think based on my research, knowledge, experience, that maybe doing more fartlek is the way I'm going to get this athlete to get this quality that I need. So challenge yourself to explore. And when exploring, you're going to take the wrong turn sometimes. But that's okay as long as you reflect on it, learn from it, and grow and adapt from it.
Speaking of explorers, that's a great point, Steve. I'm going to end here with a quote from another little pamphlet or book. Actually, there's more of a pamphlet, 20 pages long, that I just picked up. It's called Arthur Lydiard's Running Training Schedules, 20 pages long. And it basically is essentially his first published work about his methods back in 1970, so almost 50 years old. It's 15 pages of him discussing how he has figured out or how he prepared the Olympians and world record holders he did in New Zealand, and then 5 pages of just numbers and training tables and schedules. But the last paragraph of text that he offers is this: I liken coaching of distance runners to the putting together of a jigsaw puzzle. All coaches know the different methods of training, such as fartlek, long striding, sharpening, etc. And then he concludes, but as has been said many times before, and to which I prescribe, coaching is more than a science. It is an art, aimed at bringing the athlete right on the relevant day. Nothing more. I mean, when people say they're a Lydiard guy or a Lydiard gal or a Lydiard coach, well, then that, I think, you got to understand how even Lydiard thought, right? And that's exactly what it is. This is a big jigsaw. And, Lydiard is the one you look to say, oh, marathon pace training. That has really 100 miles a week. Those are things he really sounded the drum on and beat and blew the horn on. And it worked. And so did Igloy's methods. And so did, all these different other people. So take what you will on what's on offer. But know, it's very important, if anything, at the end of the day, be clear about what you mean with the different types of training that you're offering athletes and that you're employing athletes to do, so they know exactly why they are doing what they're doing, not just from a physiological, metabolic standpoint and for that threshold mechanism, but also too cognitively and psychologically, because that's going to help them too on race day, because that's at the end of the day what this is all about, getting them right on the relevant day.
Couldn't have said it better. And I'll just end with a plug. If you want to understand Lydiard and see a further breakdown, HBW Scholars Supreme Seminar. Hopefully I said that right this time.
I think so, yes. It's awesome.
Man, we are breaking down Lydiard like no other because you know what? We both have those original books, and it is fascinating. So, anyway, there's a little plug. Thanks a lot for listening. As always, guys and gals, we really appreciate it. Love the feedback, and yeah, it's a pleasure having these discussions for you guys to hear.
All right, until next time.